Well, good morning, guys. Last week, last few days of last week, I was not doing very well at all, but doing much better today. So hopefully I'll be able to get back into recording and everything, although today's is not going to be terribly long. How is that coat of arms coming? Your shield and all that. I hope you're having fun with that. I hope you're putting some thought and effort into it. Um, and will be able to explain it all to me when I return, which should be Wednesday or Thursday. Can't wait to be back. And unfortunately, guys, we just got to keep on going. We don't have time to stop or slow down. Um, but we're still talking about the medieval world, just middle and late medieval world this time with princes and popes. So Charlemagne had an empire that was the next empire after the Roman Empire. It wasn't huge, but it was most of Central Europe, and it was very large for the day. And when his empire fell, there was no one left to pick up the pieces except for the church. So the church is going to become very, very powerful. And then, of course, the kings and noblemen don't like the church being that powerful, and that's going to lead to all sorts of problems. After a time, there was a Reformation. The church got a little better. Germany established the Holy Roman Empire, which helped fill in the gaps there, and French and English kings regained control over their nations to create the modern nation state, where the king actually is in charge rather than just the nobleman. There's so many huge changes going on this time. It's naturally going to lead to conflict. No one in power wants to change the status quo. For more about this, watch Enola Holmes on Netflix about Sherlock Holmes' younger sister Enola. It's a fun movie. Um, the people in power, the people who are benefited by the status quo, don't like change. It's obviously the people who are not in power, who are not big fans of the status quo, who are driving the change, and that will always lead to conflict. And it's going to be one king versus the neighboring king. It's going to be the king versus the church as well. We're going to see huge fights between the king and the Catholic Church. And then also one church and another, the Catholics versus the Muslims, in holy wars and crusades. Here's Mr. Lemonhead coming to fix up a building or something. That's really what reform means. It means trying to fix stuff up. And of course, there were many major problems with the Catholic Church that did need fixing. So Charlemagne became king when the Pope crowned him king, and that was a huge power shift between the monarchy and the Pope, where now the king is the king because the Pope says so. But even at this time, even though he had crowned the king, the church did not really assert its dominance for some time. And the church was becoming less and less important. It's losing its prestige for a lot of good reasons, including them shooting themselves in the foot by being a really awful church. So we're talking about the 9th century, the late 800s, early 900s. The church was really very, very corrupt, doing a very poor job. Vikings were plundering everywhere, and usually in a town there were two main sources of wealth: the noblemen and the church. And the noblemen's houses were often better protected than the churches were, and churches were really easy targets. That is why they kept on building them out of stone. Probably the originally wooden churches kept on being burnt down and sacked, and so they keep on building them out of stone. And later churches do kind of resemble more fortresses than churches. But churches would have the wealth of the countryside because everyone is tithing on pain of eternal death. So the churches are very wealthy, and the Vikings are stealing all their money. And once the Vikings just keep on slaughtering priests and monks and nuns and whatever and taking all their money, a lot of people are saying, wait, I thought God was on your side. All these Vikings are worshiping idols, and you say you're worshiping the real God. How come the Vikings are winning? And it led to a lot of people questioning the church. In an effort to gain an army to defend the church, clergymen entered into the feudal system. And the church is now no longer really separate from the kings and noblemen. Now church leaders are just another type of nobleman. And the church leaders would swear fealty to a more powerful nobleman who would give them an army. The church would also give out some of its land. They would have an investiture. They would give out some of its land to a minor nobleman who would then work for them, and now they have their own army. So it's going both ways. Um, I speak just a few words of Latin here. Here's some important people. This guy's obviously a bishop with the funny bishop's hat and shepherd's crook. This guy's a king. And this says, Rex rogat abbatum Matildum supplicat something. Rex means king. Rogat, is that like King Roger or something? King Roga? And then it says abbatum, that's the abbot. He's the head of a monastery. Matildum, Abbot Matilda. Supplicat means supplications. He's asking for a favor. I'm not actually sure which one is asking the other for. It looks almost like the king is asking the bishop for a favor. I'm not sure though. But they're going back and forth. Where now the bishops and monks and people are now linked with the noblemen in an effort to gain an army. With all this came the idea of lay investiture. Now, normal investiture means giving someone a political title. For instance, if you want to make the new Duke of York, you invest a guy with the authority to be the Duke of York. That is investiture. Lay investiture means the priests picking the noblemen. So lay is the opposite of like divine. You have the church leaders, and then you have the lay people. You have the priests, and then you have the lay people. So for a long time, the kings have been picking the noblemen, and the head church leaders have been picking the minor church people. The archbishops have been picking the bishops have been picking the priests, and all that. Well, now that that there's like this interplay of church and state, there's a lot of places where the bishops are picking the noblemen. That's called lay investiture. And that led to a lot of problems. We also have the opposite happening as well, where the kings are picking the bishops. And both of these are really, really big problems. If I remember correctly, actually, might have to rewind. My brain's a little foggy. I believe lay investiture originally referred to the lay people investing the church, not the other way around. But it is going both ways, where church leaders are picking noblemen and noblemen are picking church leaders. It leads to a lot of problems. Obviously, if you have the church leader picking the government, then the government has to do whatever the church person says, and basically the church person is now the king in all but name. If you do it the other way around, where the government is picking the church leaders, it's going to be the same thing, where the king is now completely controlling the church, and he's not going to pick godly people or people who are interested in the church in any way. He's just picking his buddies to be there. And so now the church that was already problematic doctrine-wise is now going to be led by a bunch of people who aren't even claiming to be Christian. They're just picked by the king. There is a lot of problems when you mesh church and state, and just not. A reform movement started in Cluny, France in 910. This is the monastery at Cluny, although this particular building is a lot more modern than that. This is probably like 1600s or something. But those spires in the background, if I remember correctly, these spires in the background were built by Charlemagne, his people, built this part of the monastery, Cluny. Cluny held this big meeting, and they forbade simony and lay investiture. Simony is the sin of Simon the sorcerer. If you look in Acts, I should have looked up what chapter, but look in Acts where Paul is going through the island of, not Crete, Sicily? Not Sicily. I can't think. Or Cyprus. Cyprus, that's it. Paul is going through a mission trip through the town of Cyprus, and there's this one town where everyone is turning to God, and it looks really great. And it says even Simon, like their head sorcerer, got saved. And back then, sorcerer did not mean like Harry Potter, witches and wizards. Back then, sorcerer was much more like what we would think of just a false priest, a guy who worships idols, a guy who says that he can make the idols do things for you. So pay me and I'll give these gods, a good word on your behalf. So no pointy wizard's hat, no flying on broomsticks. Simon the sorcerer was a false god worshiper. Anyway, even this guy gets saved, and it's really wonderful until a couple verses later, when Paul is praying over people and they're receiving the Holy Spirit, and he says, Mr. Simon says, I'll give you $1 million if you give me the power to give the Holy Spirit to people. And they're like, all right, are you kidding me? You cannot buy God's favor. You cannot buy grace. And they took that as a pretty clear evidence that Mr. Simon was not actually a Christian. He was just going along with the flow. Everyone else was doing it. And he wanted to be, going from the head idol priest to the head Christian priest. And he just wanted to switch teams to keep his power. And that was awful. So he had a whole sin named after him, the sin of paying money to try to get grace from God. In the Middle Ages, it meant paying money to buy an official job in the church. These jobs paid very, very well. The bishops and archbishops, they got palaces, they got land, they got servants, they got armies, very powerful positions. So there are hundreds of documented, we have the contracts where the king says, give me 10,000 gold coins and I'll make you the Bishop of Cluny or whatever. And we have well-documented historical evidence that this happened all the time. People are paying millions of dollars to get these jobs. And of course, this is so, so bad. You should never be able to pay to become a church leader. So even the Catholics are like, no, that's not okay anymore. They forbade that. That lay investiture, this brand of lay investiture, I guess, is the kings picking the bishops. And they said, no, only church officials will hire church officials. And that should also help get rid of simony. They tried to restore the dignity and authority of the papacy by making the Pope a good person, at least according to their standards, making the church a good place full of good people, where the leadership is actually trying to do what's right and not just blatantly bribing their way to the top. Like, yeah, we got to fix that. So, they are fixing some major problems in the church, but they're not getting to the doctrinal problems that we would have with Catholicism. So ultimately, how much good is it going to do? Bernard of Clairvaux started a new organization called the Cistercian monks. And a big part of his organization was to become a monk, you have to do this vow of poverty where you will own nothing, not even the clothes on your back. Everyone wears these robe uniforms, very plain uniform, and you have to, basically in the monastery, even owns the uniform, so you're just wearing the same robes as everyone else. So promise not to look for power or wealth or a house or lands. We're just going to devote our life to prayer and all that. So a couple hundred years after Cluny, this idea has been going on for a while, of lay investiture, and there's fights back and forth about that and simony and all this. Cluny does not fix the problem. It fixes it for a while and people go back and forth. Anyway, in 1059, the College of Cardinals was founded, and its main job is to choose the Pope, because there was literally a Pope who was picked by a king, and that's not great. There were other popes who bought their way to the top, and that's not great. By the way, cardinal means most important. Maybe you've heard of the cardinal points of the compass, north, south, east, west. Cardinal means most important. They wore bright red robes because they were important. When Europeans came to America and they found a bright red bird, they said, hey, it looks like they're wearing cardinal's robes. So they called it the cardinal. And that's why the bird's bright red is named after the people's bright red robes. Anyway, they're going to choose the Pope. And the cardinals are all of the top archbishops and whatever. Gregory VII was the most influential Reformed Pope. He was a Benedictine monk, so he came out of that austerity idea. He believed that not necessarily separation of church and state, but that the church, he should control the kings. So kind of opposite of what had been happening, where the kings are controlling the church. Now he's trying to bring it full circle, and he's controlling the kings. And people had been waffling back and forth on whether lay investiture was okay. He told a German king, if you keep on trying to hire these priests and bishops outside of my authority, I will excommunicate you and send you directly to hell. Well, pretty powerful stuff there. Henry IV of Germany said, no, I'm not going to stop lay investiture. and said, in fact, I don't even think that you're the real Pope. I do not recognize your papal authority, and calls him a false monk. Obviously, going after the head of the church like that is going to lead to a power struggle, and who's going to win, the church or the king? Well, Gregory instantly excommunicates him, and the German noblemen, who had been very powerful for a long time, the German noblemen raise an army and come to the king and suggest politely that he ask forgiveness of the Pope or get his head chopped off. So faced with the entire army of Germany fighting against him, I guess he thought he would have the nobles on his side, but he did not. He did go to the Pope and ask for forgiveness. The Pope was in a winter palace in the mountains of Italy, like a ski resort type idea, Swiss chalet. And Gregory went up there with a small retinue. And here's a picture. He took off his royal robes and his crown and even his shoes, and he's wearing sackcloth, and he is barefoot. And he walks through the snowbanks. And I guess here's some buddies of his who had also been excommunicated. He walks through the snowbanks to the front door and bangs on the door. And a servant's like, yes. And he's like, hi, I'm the king. I'm here to ask the Pope's forgiveness. And the servant's like, okay, I'll let him know. The servant goes inside, tells the Pope, the king's here, barefoot in the snow. And the Pope said, yeah, we'll let him wait. And so Gregory the Fourth is like kneeling in a snowbank for like, I think it was like a total of 3 days. He's kneeling in the snowbank forever, getting frostbite and shivering. And finally the Pope says, you know what? I think that's enough humility for you, and brings him in and forgives him. Here's another picture of him actually wearing his crown and his robe and everything in the snowbank. That's probably just so people know who he is. There's a little doggy next to him. Unfortunately, well, I don't know about unfortunately, but he gets forgiven. He gets recommunicated, goes back to Germany, and almost immediately he goes back on his word and keeps on fighting with the Pope. And there's more information in your book. And when I get back, I'll bring you some outside extras. But he and further German kings keep on fighting, and really Germany is a hotbed of struggle between the church and state until the Concordat of Worms in 1122 that settled that issue. 100 years later. There are two new types of monks that pop up at this time, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. See, the Cistercian monks, was that the earliest or one of the earliest types of monks? They secluded themselves in a monastery and wouldn't talk to anyone ever. We're just going to pray here and forget the outside world. The Franciscans and Dominicans had an opposite idea. They said, no, we are here to minister to the people, not to ignore them. We're here to serve. So they started calling themselves friars or frère, which means brother, as in Frère Jacques. Frère Jacques, Frère Jacques. I'm not going to sing for you. We're your brothers. We're not your father, like all the priests are called your fathers, here to have authority over you and tell you what to do. We're your brothers. We're just here to help you. Give food to the poor and clothing, and a lot of the first Christian hospitals were run by people like these, monks or nuns running a hospital, taking care of people. By the way, early hospitals were not just medical in nature. Hospital has the same word as hospitality. It means taking care of people. So a lot of hospitals back then meant the same thing as today. Think of a mixture of a doctor's office and an emergency room and a bakery and a hotel and a battered woman's shelter and all of the above. It's just taking care of the people in your neighborhood, which is a very worthy goal. Some of these people are called mendicants, which I believe means they're traveling around, taking care of people. The Franciscans get their name from Francis of Assisi, who was a very kind-hearted man, and apparently he loved God's world so much. He wrote a hymn. Was it "This Is My Father's World"? I'm going to look that up and get back to you in 1 minute. I do know that Francis of Assisi was such a kind person that he loved the animals so much that he would talk to them and they would talk back. and he would tell him what to do, and he was a little Snow White there. I do know Francis of Assisi was the first person to start a manger scene at Christmas because he wanted everyone to see what it was like for Jesus way back in the day. Little Lord Jesus is sleeping tonight. Mr. Dominic of the Dominican order wanted his focus to be fighting heresy, which, of course, their version of heresy and our version of heresy might be very, very different. And his was a little more cruel, burning people at the stake and all that instead of feeding the poor. And I looked up the poem that he wrote. It is All Creatures of Our God and King, which is a delightful poem. And it was set to music hundreds of years later. Pretty cool. All right, zenith. Zenith is the point where the sun is the highest in the sky. It's the highest mark of the papacy, the most powerful part of the papacy. Innocent III was by far the most powerful pope ever. He said, I am the sun, the emperor is the moon. Basically saying, everything revolves around me, and the kings only get their power from me, from my reflected light. So, yeah, a little proud there, maybe. By this time, the church is incredibly large and wealthy. Many, many noblemen donate huge areas of land or money or resources to the church to try to get their way to heaven. And of course, that stays with the church throughout the generations. So the church is one of the most powerful entities on the planet. They say of Innocent III, he humbled kings because there were many times that he fought against kings big and little, and he made them do what he said. He used such papal weapons as excommunication. You don't do what I say, I will send you to hell. And people took that very seriously. And when he excommunicated people, they did everything they could to get back in his good graces. Even worse than excommunication is interdict. Interdict is excommunicating an entire region or an entire country all at once. Imagine if President Biden did something so awful that everyone in America is now on its way to hell. Obviously, we would do whatever we could to either make Biden behave or kick him out and get a better president. Thankfully, no one on earth has the power to send every American to hell, unlike what the Pope would say. But interdict was used on a couple of occasions, and it was very, very scary. When you are excommunicated or under interdict, you're not allowed to do any of the sacraments. So when you're born, you're not allowed to be baptized. And so many babies died shortly after childbirth that if they were not baptized, they believed that they would go straight to hell. So you have to baptize your babies immediately. So there's a sticking clock where we got to baptize my baby. You're not allowed to get married. You're not allowed to be buried. That is a church service. So if you were buried outside of holy ground, if you were buried by someone other than the priest with a special ceremony, you might come back as a vampire or a werewolf or some monster, or you might be a ghost. A lot of ghost stories are of European people in the Middle Ages who were not buried properly, and they're not allowed into heaven. They're good people, so they're not allowed into hell, but they weren't buried properly, so they're not allowed to heaven, so they're just doomed to wander. And that's how a lot of the ghost stories started. And of course, this is all utter nonsense, but this is what they believed, and very sad. You're not allowed to have Mass, and if you don't have Mass, then Jesus isn't sacrificed for you this week, so that's a problem. Lots of problems being interdicted. And then, of course, the Inquisition. If there was a heresy detected in your area, they would set up a church. The Inquisition is a church trial court. Can't even think. Thank you. And they would put you on trial for being a heretic. And because it was not run by the king or the noblemen, there were no rules. They could do whatever they wanted. They would often torture you until you confessed. And when you confessed, you were given a swift death. And if you didn't confess, you were tortured to death. So it didn't really matter if you were innocent or guilty. It just mattered that after they killed you, they got all your stuff. So of course there's major reasons to just call any rich person a heretic, because then you could torture them to death and steal all their stuff. If anybody has anything negative to say about the church, you gotta do it very quietly, or else they're gonna get you. Very terrible, very awful. And of course this is done with the Pope's blessing, and the Pope speaks with God's word, so of course this is 100% legit, right? So the church has been changing and reforming. And those reforms successfully made the church very rich and very strong, very powerful, even over the kings and noblemen. But sadly, those reforms are all based at prestige and power, not holiness. The church became more successful, but the church did not become more godly or even a little bit godly. It got powerful instead. As if you want to become powerful, you can become powerful. If you want to become godly, you can become godly. But you get what you love. If you want to be rich, you can get rich. Whatever you want, that's what you're going to pursue. And chances are you are going to reach your goal if you work hard enough at any goal. Um, let's make sure that our goals are good goals, because what's worse than failing is succeeding at something that really doesn't matter or is even a bad thing. Don't be like these guys. Don't search for money and power and wealth and prestige and fame at the expense of godliness.